classic 70s children's book. So, if you are also having a rainy, stormy evening where you are and are in the mood for a cozy, old-time favorite, stick around. This book, of course, was written by Arnold Lobel. He wrote many different Frog and Toad books, but this is one of my favorites. Let's see, there are 6 stories. I think I'll read like 2 or 3. This one is called Spring. Frog ran up the path to Toad's house. He knocked on the front door. There was no answer. "Toad, Toad," shouted Frog. "Wake up! It is spring." "Blah," said a voice from inside the house. "Toad, Toad," cried Frog. "The sun is shining. The snow is melting. Wake up." "I'm not here," said the voice. Frog walked into the house. It was dark. All the shutters were closed. "Toad, where are you?" called Frog. "Go away," said the voice from a corner of the room. Toad was lying in bed. He had pulled all the covers over his head. Frog pushed Toad out of bed. He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. Toad blinked in the bright sun. "Help," said Toad. "I cannot see anything." "Don't be silly," said Frog. "What you see is the clear, warm light of April, and it means that we can begin a whole new year together, Toad. Think of it," said Frog. "We will skip through the meadows and run through the woods and swim in the river. In the evenings, we will sit right here on this front porch and count the stars." "You can count them, Frog," said Toad. "I will be too tired. I'm going back to bed." Toad is such a curmudgeon. I love it. Toad went back into the house. He got into bed and pulled the covers over his head again. "But Toad," cried Frog, "you will miss all the fun." "Listen, Frog," said Toad. "How long have I been asleep?" "You've been asleep since November," said Frog. "Well then," said Toad, "a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back and wake me up at about 1/2 May. Good night, Frog." Frog's little sport jacket is so 70s. Okay. "But Toad," said Frog, "I will be lonely until then." Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page, and the January page, and the February page, and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off April page too. Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. "Toad, Toad, wake up. It's May now." "What?" said Toad. "Can it be May so soon?" "Yes," said Frog. me think of a story to tell you. Toad thought and thought, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. I will go out on the front porch and walk up and down, said Toad. Perhaps that will help me to think of a story. Toad walked up and down on the porch for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad went into the house and stood on his head. Why are you standing on your head? Asked Frog. I hope that if I stand on my head it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. Toad stood on his head for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Toad man, what a character. Then Toad poured a glass of water over his head. Why are you pouring water over your head? Asked Frog. I hope that if I pour water over my head, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he could still not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. Why are you banging your head against the wall? Asked Frog. I hope that if I bang my head against the wall hard enough, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. I'm feeling much better now, Toad, said Frog. I do not think I need a story anymore. Then you get out of bed and let me get into it, said Toad, because now I feel terrible. Frog said, would you like me to tell you a story, Toad? Yes, said Toad, if you know one. Once upon a time, said Frog, there were two friends, a frog and a toad. The frog was not feeling well. He asked his friend the toad to tell him a story. The toad could not think of a story. He walked up and down on the porch, but he could not think of a story. He stood on his head, but he could not think of a story. He poured water over his head, but he could not think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but he still could not think of a story. Then the toad did not feel so well, and the frog was feeling better, so the toad went to bed and the frog got up and told him a story. The end. How was that, Toad? Said Frog. But Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. I forgot how adorable these were. Alright, the next one is the last button. Toad and Frog went for a walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked into the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. Oh, drat, said Toad. Not only do my feet hurt, but I've lost one of the buttons on my jacket. Don't worry, said Frog. We'll go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button. They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. Here's your button, cried Frog. That is not my button, said Toad. That button is black. My button was white. Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. Excuse me, said the sparrow. Did you lose a button? I found one. That is not my button, said Toad. That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes. Toad put the button with the 2 holes in his pocket. your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered in buttons, and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor he saw his white, four-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I've made for Frog." Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. That's so cute.